Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the DDT Method podcast. This week, I'm sitting down to have a conversation with Ian Mitchell, and we're going to go over everything health, wellness, and performance, but through a lens that you probably haven't considered it before. Before we dive into everything, Ian, give us a little bit of background on yourself. What is it that you're doing? What are you working on? What's your background?
Pretty varied. So usually I get hit with the moniker of polymath because I'm lucky enough to be able to work in chemistry, biochemistry, materials science, physics, quantum physics. I work a lot with biophysics, doing a lot of work with lasers and stem cells and things like that. I taught biochemistry. It's pretty varied, man. I think I'm just overly curious. Like when I see something that is kind of a puzzle that seems difficult or intractable, it catches my attention. And I'm kind of like a dog with a bone. I don't generally put it down until I've figured it out. And so it's been kind of a curse and a blessing because professionally it's been great. It's allowed me to work on all sorts of projects, like with NASA and all kinds of other people. But it's also one of those things that is probably a tad of the tism because I really can't let something go until I've totally figured it out.
Awesome. Now, let me just say right off the bat, that introductory sentence alone is going to give every future guest a complex on trying to deliver right off the bat. So thank you for that.
Paying it forward.
Exactly. No, that's amazing. And you're working with a number of different companies, and you do have your own companies as well. And Wizard Sciences is where I first found out about what you're doing. And actually, that's a lie. I found out as we discussed off air. So you did a podcast with one of my mentors, Ben Pakulski, on the Muscle Intelligence podcast. And I remember listening to that and going, all right, if I get a chance, I'm gonna pick this guy's brain. And flash forward a few years, and thank God I have a podcast that can deliver just enough to entice you to be here so I can pick your brain. So let's dive right into it. So Wizard Sciences is an incredibly innovative company, and you guys are one of the main sources of information on what's called carbon-60. And I've spoken about it briefly before, but carbon-60 is a life-changing supplement or molecule or however you want to break it down. So why don't you just start by tell us what carbon-60 is and why is it something that athletes in particular, if not everybody, should consider supplementing with?
Yeah, my personal take, I wish I could kind of beat the drum loud enough to get everybody on it. Like if we lived in a perfect environment where we weren't subjected to EMF stress and chemical toxins all the time, I'd probably just be chill about it. But given that we're always under assault, it's kind of necessary. So carbon-60 it's a soccer ball. Literally, it's a truncated icosahedron made of carbon atoms. So there are 60 carbon atoms, hence carbon-60, that are all clustered together. And it's an allotropic form. So carbon, you can get, amorphous carbon like charcoal. You can have diamonds. You can have graphite, graphene. It's all just different configurations of carbon. I mean, we're literally built on a carbon backbone. And so carbon-60 is great because it's both an electron acceptor and donor. So you can think of it more like an adaptogen, but sort of like a nanoscale adaptogen. And it's very tiny. And because of that, if you modulate it certain ways, you can get it to elicit all kinds of crazy cell behavior. So initially when it was discovered, the guys that discovered it, there was 3 guys and they, all got Nobel Prizes for it. I actually only know one of the guys, and he was this super sweet old chemist in Texas that was really very good chemist, very sharp. And he ran a big lab at Rice University. And initially they thought it was going to be something that was industrial because it's little nanoscopic bearings, if you will, that are stronger than carbon steel. So it's incredibly lubricous, right? It will lubricate anything just about better than anything else because it's little tiny marbles that are 1.2 nanometers wide. So initially they started doing it for industrial applications like downhole well drilling and things where they were trying to lubricate things under high pressure. And then at some point somebody thought, well, let's see if there are any biological applications. And most people didn't think there would be, but they started figuring out how you can bind it to fats. And if you bind it to fats, you can actually get it to move into the cell membranes. And one of the common tests that you're doing when you're working on new compounds is a thing called an LD50. And it's a lethal dosing study where you see like how much of this do I have to give to typically a population of mice to see what kills, 50% of them. And what they found was kind of bizarre, that it didn't actually kill them. Like they couldn't give them enough to kill them, which kind of makes sense because if you go in to get detoxified, like if you have, poisoning from alcohol or something, they'll hit you with carbon to bind to the toxins and then flush it out. So with the carbon 60, once they got it into, a living system, they found that it detoxified the liver, detoxified the kidneys, made the animals basically pretty much impervious to chemotoxicity, chemical stress. Like like in my lab, if I'm trying to knock out a mouse and it's got, carbon 60 in it, you have to use a thing called carbon tetrachloride, but you have to knock it out with about 2.25 times as much CCl4 as you would to knock out a normal mouse, right? Because it's super robust. Another research group did a thing where they were hitting mice with lethal doses of radiation. And if a mouse has carbon 60 in its system, it's pretty much buffered, right? You can hit it with a lethal dose of radiation and it just keeps on doing its very mousy things. So they found that it was really, really beneficial. But the super weird thing, and when I first heard this, I thought it was total bullshit, was I read the paper on it and it said that the lifespan extension, they bumped out their lifespan 90%. And I thought, surely that cannot be real. But at the time I was working on some stuff and I thought, you know what? I'll give it a whirl. So I basically recreated that experiment and I did it with a thing called P53 knockout mice, which your P53 gene is your tumor suppressor gene. So you breed these mice specifically so that they have no innate tumor suppression. We use them in oncology a lot because they idiopathically, which is just like a spontaneous random presentation of tumors. So they idiopathically present with tumors. And so you use them to test different types of chemo and different procedures and things like that so you can see what's going to affect the cancer. Well, so I figured, okay, these mice have the shortest lifespan. So I did a homozygous, which is just a negative negative. So there's no gene for tumor suppression anywhere in them. And they have, in oncology, we've probably used like hundreds of thousands of these things over the past couple decades. So they have these insanely well-defined mortality curves. Like, within, say, 2 weeks plus or minus when they're going to die. And so mine should have keeled over right at about 6 months. And that's kind of what I was anticipating, but they didn't. They actually, it bumped out the median lifespan to 93% more than they should have been. So it's like, which would be, it was crazy, man. I mean, it was really kind of crazy because that would be the equivalent of you or I living to like, men and women respectively, say like 147 to 151,
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely crazy. And I was like, it kind of blew my mind because I was really working on anti-inflammatory stuff and trying to, knock out autoimmune responses for arthritic conditions and things at the time. And I was doing it for a veterinary project at the time, but it became relatively apparent relatively quickly to me that the safety profile was super low and the benefits were just off the charts. And I figured by the time I really could suss this out and see if it was viable for people, I would probably have aged like 15 to 20 years. So I just started hammering the stuff back when I first did it. And partially because you can do a lot with, laboratory animals, but I don't speak mouse. So it's very difficult to understand like what biologically they're perceiving. So I tested it on myself and it was fantastic. I mean, you get this energy. I mean, you take it, you get this energy boost. You have more muscular strength, like all of the metrics that you'd normally think are really positive go up, and you're buffered against a lot of things that are kind of bad in the environment. But at the time, my dog was 7, and I had a Great Pyrenees Golden Retriever mix, so like a 2XL Golden.
Mhm.
And he, just because of the way they're put together, his hips were really kind of going out, and he could no longer hop up on my bed and hang out with me. And it was honestly kind of sad. He'd like put his front paws up and scooch up on the bed. And then when he was getting down, he'd put his front paws down and literally just pull his legs forward until they plopped and hit the ground. And then he'd stand up. And it was a bummer. So I started dosing him. And a couple of weeks later, he was literally running and jumping back on the bed with me. And I was like, whoa, okay, this is epic. And so I just continued to do it and then built a company around it and then built another company around it. And I haven't really sat idly by and just done like the basic, bind it to, a lot of people do it with olive oil. Some people do it with coconut oil. But my thought was, well, okay, how far can I push this? Like, what can I get it to do? And so I started looking at how much of it, because the common thought at the time was that the binding capacity was, technically it's 0.8 milligrams per milliliter. And so I thought, well, let's see if that's true. So I spent about 6 to 8 months just testing different configurations, different combinatory methods. And I figured out that I could actually bind more than 4 times that amount if I adjusted the lipids, right? Because it's still less than 1% typically. And so all the stuff I make is usually at 1.2%.
Mhm.
Which is a big jump. It's like 150% boost over what you normally see. And I caught a lot of flack for it because people said, oh, and the literature says it's not possible. And it's totally possible. It's just like anything else, you have to address all of the different factors and then figure out what actually jives. And once you do that, you can kind of make magic happen. And so I did that and got a lot of really good benefit from that. But then I started thinking, okay, I'm addressing kind of like the negative cycle, like how much energy loss does a cell have? So, and your whole audience will get this. So the mitochondria, which are really kind of driving the bus energetically, if you just take the C60 at, that strength, you get a boost between 18 and 58% in mitochondrial efficiency, and your ATP output goes up in accordance. But that's just on one edge of the cycle. So I figured I'll adjust both edges, right? So I started putting in like NMN, resveratrol, astaxanthin, CoQ10, PQQ, like all this stuff to really make it sing.
So what you basically did was you took something. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. What you basically did initially is you were trying to fix somebody's achy elbows and wrists and accidentally stumbled on Immortality. So, or on your way to that. So, which is, I don't want to just gloss over that initial discovery because that's insane. And one other thing I don't want to gloss over is the thing about your dog, because I also started subtly putting one dose into all 3 of my dogs' dinner every single day without telling the missus, because she always gets a little sketched out if I'm just pixie dusting supplementation into our dogs. So I just started adding this one in, and I've got 3 pit bulls. I have a 1-year-old, I have a 3-year-old, and I have an 11-year-old. The 11-year-old's got bad knees, bad hips, and he was starting to really slow down, bad limp and everything like that. Literally 3 weeks into beginning to administer this daily, he started doing this weird gallop bounce run, and he hadn't had the Zooms in the backyard in probably a year plus. And then that started going more and more and more. And now he's up every morning begging his mom to take him on a big walk throughout the neighborhood and through the woods and through the trails and everything like that. And it was like, wow, I don't know what we did. We changed something in his diet, and I don't know what it could have been. And she's like, well, I mean, I started giving them pumpkin. Maybe I'll start giving them more pumpkin. Then finally I'm like, I didn't want the dogs shitting all over the house from over pumpkin consumption. So I'm like, all right, here's what I've been doing. And she was sold. So just had to double down on that. So let's go
totally
back
true,
to,
that's
oh yeah, it's incredible.
I had.
And 3 weeks, which is nuts. Now, I've noticed in myself just general benefits as far as recovery goes. I supplement with a lot of different things to try and optimize every course. And this is something that I noticed fairly dramatically, which doesn't really happen much for me anymore. And not for nothing, in the past 20 years, I've also used almost every PED that exists. Mm-hmm. So for me to notice something, it's very substantial. So that's what really started, because like every other meathead on the planet, somebody that I trust said, this is really good. I started looking into it. I was familiar with the brand because I was familiar with your brand. All right, let me throw it in there. Okay, yeah, I'll give it a shot. Oh, wow, there's something to this. So then I start doing my follow-up research more thoroughly than it took for me to try it. And I did notice that you do have all these other things added into your main products, your Neuro RX and your Olympia RX. Yeah. So you're putting these things in because these seem to be the substituents that basically feed the cell while you're making the cell stronger. So how exactly is the carbon 60 in and of itself strengthening the cell? Is it working like a superoxide dismutase? Is it just removing stress as it comes in, or?
Yeah, so it actually does. It works a lot like glutathione or SOD2. And so it buffers the oxidative stress load. And so the net effect of that is your your cells are always under stress. And if you can eliminate that stress, then they just function more effectively. So a lot of the stranger things I've noticed, like once you really get it spooled up in your system, if you're doing like a tablespoon a day, you need fewer calories because your cells are literally that much more efficient. You just kind of you don't have the desire to, like there's always that leptin ghrelin balance, and your body just gets the signal and is like, nah, not hungry, because you're running efficiently. So when you knock out the oxidative stress load, you're getting that, like I said, 18 to 58% bump. But when you add in all the other components, it really does. It feeds the energetic cycle. And when it's not under assault from all these other things, it's more efficient. And so you get a really big boost. Like in terms of muscular capacity, one of the other things that's kind of neat is there was this old Russian paper on it, and it does this thing called super precipitation of skeletal muscle actomyosin, which is basically just you can fire more muscle and it's a dose dependent function. So if you do a larger dose, like one of our mutual friends did some before a big competition and was doing these ridiculous amounts of weight and texted me after the fact and said, man, it felt like I was just lifting air, you know, because even your brain downregulates your muscular firing capacity to 10 or rather 25 to 30%, give or take, of what it actually is. And it saves the rest. It keeps the rest of the gas in the tank in case you have like a fight or flight thing where you really have to do something. And then it activates all of your muscle fibers. And you get like the, the adrenaline dump, norepinephrine and all that stuff. And then you really can fire everything. Well, this bypasses the mechanism that normally shuts that down. And so you can literally do, twice as much as you normally do. Actually, one of my friends has a tonal, one of the automated things on the wall that uses AI to track everything. And he showed me his tonal results, and it was before and then after. And he had an 80% or 87, I think, percent jump in his maxes, literally across almost every single, exercise. The one thing I did tell him was, look, you're going to feel like Captain America. Do not push yourself as hard as you can because the soreness is still a factor. And so, he was doing all these reps and was like just crushing it and hitting all these PRs. And so he did that for like 3 days and then was, gimped out for days after that because, you still get sore and you don't activate that much of your muscle fiber. So when you do, you've got to take precautions. Like, and I tell all the Olympic athletes and pro athletes that I work with that are on that same thing, right? Your muscles can adjust really rapidly, but all of your cartilaginous stuff doesn't, right? Your tendons and your ligaments, they don't get the same degree of blood flow as your muscles. So you've got to kind of work it up over time. There's some guys like Blaine McConnell, our mutual friend, that Blaine has taken a lot of time to really work up all of his connective tissue. He does just a litany of plyometrics and all kinds of stuff. And I mean, he's strong as an ox, and ridiculously fast. Far faster, admittedly, than you'd think somebody that is that big would be. But it's because he's taken the time to actually do the work to make sure that all the connections are okay.
Mhm.
And because of that, he's really like he always jokes that he's trying to become an X-Man. And that's kind of what it's like is when you do that consistently, and your muscles allow you to fire more. You don't weigh anymore, but you're literally multiples of your normal strength, and it's kind of crazy cool. I've done it a couple times, but I try not to do it that much because I don't do the same degree of plyometric work and make sure that, all of my connective tissues can handle it because the muscles absolutely can. And I've done it a couple times. The reason I know that can be an issue is first time it happened for me, I was doing a high dose and I pulled my hamstring twice in a row. And then the third time, and this was before I had made the connection to what was actually going on, I was playing baseball with my youngest son and he threw a ball. And I swung at it and it was like this crazy, like crack. And literally it just went over the tree line. And I was like, I cannot hit that hard. That's nuts. So I kind of hunkered down, Daryl Strawberry style. And was like, all right, pitch it again. And I swung to crank with everything I had. And when I cranked, I tore the muscle in my lower back
Oh,
away.
wow.
Yeah. And I literally fell to the ground. I was like, ah, you know, but I started laughing because it finally clicked in my head the third time. I was like, oh my God, I'm exceeding the strength of my connective tissue with the muscles, right? Like the muscles are firing so hard. And I kind of mentally made the connection to this old Russian paper that I'd read about, activating muscle fibers in proportion to how much you're taking. And then it finally locked in. I was like, oh, I get it. Okay. I got to
Mhm.
tell people like to, tone it down, work up to it and be careful. It's kind of ridiculous because, I mean, if you went out and you did 2 tablespoons, I assure you, if you go out and do that and then lift, you will beat every PR you have.
Oh, I'm positive.
I mean, yeah, and it's this, like you said, right? Like you've done every PED over the past 20 years, and you still notice an effect. Honestly, sometimes it's bizarre to me that people haven't flagged it as, a performance enhancing supplement because it arguably is about the best one I think I've ever seen. And if you know what you're doing and you dose it properly, I don't know about anything else other maybe than giving yourself a big whopping dose of adrenaline that actually allows you to have, you know, kind of that like ridiculous shift in strength.
Well, when you're enhancing cellular function, as you know, it's going to enhance whatever it is that you're doing. So you have to match those modalities appropriately. If you're operating primarily with your phosphocreatine system for like explosive, fast recruitment of strength, you're going to be able to do that way faster, probably
Right.
faster than your joints and tendons can handle at first.
Living testament. Yeah.
And then on the flip side to that, if you're training with a more metabolic stimulus, something that's driving AMPK, let's say longer duration sets, lower rest periods, and you're just, ATP to ADP to AMP to AMPK and that whole cascade, you're going to do it significantly faster and more efficiently, which is going to lead to more mitochondrial biogenesis. And then you have to be prepared to deal with what that's going to do in terms of your capability for output. So there's all these things that people tend to overlook because they want to put in the substance but not put in the adequate stimulus or match the stimulus to the substance and whatnot. And now finally we're in this place where I think it's because of the ease of obtainment for all these peptides that people are starting to pay attention to the cellular level, just because somebody can put out a MOTC and SLU PP332, which phenomenal compounds, peptides, small molecules and whatnot, but it's starting to make a lot of people that were just focused on, the low-hanging fruit of performance and saying, well, wait a minute, if I do this, then this happens. If I optimize cellular function, no matter what I'm doing on top of that, it's going to be more effective. Now, I did notice that, well, I say I did notice. I've noticed a while, and I take both, but if we can articulate the reasoning why they exist, we have Neuro RX and Olympia RX, and that's the difference is essentially what they're suspended in. Now, is the MCT, is that because that's breaking the blood-brain barrier? Is that better for cognitive performance? When do I take each one? Do I marry them to different tasks?
Well, you do. So the neural was specifically made for people with cognitive deficits. It was an Alzheimer's thing. And that's what I was trying to figure out how to knock out was Alzheimer's. And that's why that exists. But if you don't have some massive cognitive deficit, then it's just a super nootropic, right? So, and we've measured it. The fellow, Drew Pearson, who developed the 40 Years of Zen program, he's a neuroscientist. We tested it. And you can do, like, and myself, it was more than double the neural evoked potential. So you gauge how much energy your neurons are actually able to potentiate fire, and we could more than double it. And that's pretty much across the board. But it's because, like you said, it's what lipid is it suspended in. So I realized that, I'm never going to outpace nature, right? Like it's the ultimate in terms of figuring things out. So a lot of what I do is just kind of try and understand how nature puts things together, and then do a lot of biomimicry to see, okay, how do I mimic that effect and put it in a format that people can benefit from it. So with that one, it's in the caprylic acid, which is just the C8 fraction of an MCT. And it's because it's the most bioavailable for the brain, but it follows a different pathway in terms of breaking down. So it'll break down and fractionate in your liver, turn to ketone bodies, and then pump straight up to your brain. And it will have, some of those bound neuroparticles or nanoparticles rather with it. And when that goes in, you get that huge boost in cognitive function. So the clarity goes up. But there are other things. So if you're trying to work on the eyes, you want to do like an EPA DHA. If you want to work on systemic muscular function, you do oleic acid. And so I just figured out like, oh, okay, the body already breaks all this stuff down and will sort different lipids in different factions, like wherever it needs to go. So I'm not going to try and reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to let the body do what it does brilliantly well anyway and give it all the tools. And so when you do that, the neural function goes up, and, there's a real high degree of mental acuity and clarity that comes from it. And it's, and I've tested it. I've done a lot of testing on it, both personally and with, large groups of people. And the effects are pretty profound. I mean, we've rolled back things that are typically considered to be cognitive issues that aren't able to be fixed. You just can kind of palliatively deal with them and hope it doesn't get worse too quickly. But we've actually completely eliminated things like that. And it's, again, the body is really brilliant and knows what it's doing if you can just figure out the right tools. And I completely agree with all the peptides and things like that. Everybody and their brother now is doing BPC in some form or fashion, but it's great. I genuinely do not understand why it's, on the banned substance list, because, all it really does is drop inflammation and help you repair faster. but for some reason that's not helpful for athletes, I guess. I don't
Which is a whole other. I recently, and I cannot say any more than the next sentence, but I recently wrapped up a very long and stressful fight with the World Anti-Doping Agency on behalf of a client or alongside a client for something pertaining to that. But
Yeah.
it all went well at the end of the day, and that's literally why I can only say that about it. But that's a whole other realm of conversation.
I mean, I work with a lot of pro athletes, and so with the guys like that, because of the quantum stuff that I do, ultimately all this stuff is kind of everything we've talked about is sort of biochemical in nature, but really that's just one format to convey information. And so the other thing that I work with a lot is, I lecture about quantum biology a lot, and how you can basically you convey information in different formats. You can do it with light, you can do it with sound, you can do it with chemicals, or you can literally just do it with vibrations and quantum fields. And so for a lot of the athletes, it's illegal for them to have BPC. However, I can entrain BPC into a liquid and then get the information for that into their system, and they still get the effect even though they're not using the compound. And I know you have the quanta vitamins that I make, and that's the idea there was to just take a basic vitamin and make it more bioavailable by virtue of tooling it up on a quantum level, which sounds a little frou-frou because usually, you think of like, oh, I have quantum cornflakes. And, and everybody throws the term around for marketing, and it's usually total bullshit. But every now and then you get something like the Leela stuff we do, because I'm the chief science advisor at Leela Quantum. And we've done 70 plus, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials just to show that it actually works. And it's difficult to wrap your brain around the idea that you can have something that's a non-local function, so it doesn't have to be in the same room. You can actually effectively stream the benefit of something to a person. I use it with the vitamins because it's a little strange. Like in the lab, I'll do a test and, you can run a spectral analysis on something and it says, this compound is X, right? And that's pretty much as far as we go typically in biochem. But if you run a redox potential reaction on it, you can have the same compound and one you've quantum charged and one you haven't. And the redox potential is profoundly different. It functions almost as if it's an entirely different substance. And, literally same compound from the same vial, one is charged, one isn't. That in and of itself is pretty profound. But the thing that always is the most amazing to me is that it doesn't just move it in one direction, right? If it's more beneficial to have the redox dip, the redox dips on those compounds. If it's more beneficial to have it rise up, it goes up. And that one's a little bit strange to wrap your head around because you have to, at some point, like I had to rationalize the fact that there's obviously some sort of underlying intelligence that's kind of the stratum that everything else is built on. And it's obviously way sharper than we are as people, but it's there, and you do those experiments over and over and you're like, okay, it's weird. But if you're a good scientist, the idea of pushing technology forward and in information as a whole is that sometimes you're going to hit a wall and you go, I have no idea how the hell that works, but it's a repeatable experiment. I can do it over and over and over again with the same result. So obviously my understanding is only kind of a partial understanding of how this stuff works. And I kind of liken it a lot of times to where we are biochemically. Somebody gives you a box and you say, oh, this is a blue box. Cool. Well, is the blue box filled with lead? Is the blue box filled with feathers? Right? Like they have an entirely different impact, even though if you just run an analysis from the outside, which is basically what we're doing, when we're running like, GCMS or something like that, is to say, hey, I've got a blue box, right? Like this is vitamin C, this is zinc. Okay, cool. That's great. But how does it function? Right. And so that's the part I actually like right now, is because trying to stay true to science, you do hit those walls, and maybe I'll never figure out exactly what it is because I, to the best of my knowledge, don't know anyone who has a quantumometer and can gauge all the quantum effects. Because I mean, as people, we're trying to move forward technologically, but we're limited by what we can test and what we can assess. And as has been proven out over time, there are ever and ever finer degrees of granularity that you can keep breaking things down to. Initially everybody thought it was like Newtonian motion. And then, you go from Newtonian physics to, kind of relativistic physics. And then you go from relativity down to subatomic things. And then you start looking at quantum things. And then it's just kind of how far down does the onion go as you peel the layers back. it's a little humbling sometimes because you just kind of you hit these points where you're like, okay, I know it's happening, but I have absolutely no clue how. But that's the beauty of it, though, right? In science, you're supposed to be agnostic as to what the test says and just keep pulling the thread, right? You try and push forward into stuff that you don't understand because anybody can just go, well, it's this way because the book says it's that way. Well, if all of your experimental data is in contrast to that, then you have to go, I need to do a little more digging. And again, myself and a lot of other people are working on things like that. I don't know that we'll actually figure it out in my lifetime. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, but I think it's at least worthwhile to note that we're hitting the very edge of where we are scientifically. We're kind of at the very edge, and it's very clearly necessary that we move forward.
Agreed 1,000%. Now let's take this opportunity to dive down this rabbit hole a little bit more because I have my own experiences utilizing and just diving, or I might even say dipping a toe into the world of quantum technology. And for me, it really started with my buddy Alex Keuchel, because Alex started putting some information out on his quantum charging devices. I messaged him and said, "Hey, give me a little bit of info on this. This is interesting." So he gave me some stuff to look into on it. I started watching some videos, watching some podcasts. That kind of snowballed. Eventually, I ended up talking to our friend Todd Shipman. Did an episode of the podcast with Todd, and when discussing with Todd, I kind of broke it down a little bit to kind of give him my understanding of it, to ask him if I was on the right track. And he liked the analogy, and I looked at it as, if you were to take a piece of paper and draw some molecules on it, the piece of paper is essentially quantum. That's kind of like everything in the background. And that was the most simplistic way that my brain could wrap around describing it. And then I tried to get into the realm of, all right, harnessing it and trying to understand that. And that's a whole different playing field. So all I can do is I can provide my practical experience. So I'm an all-in type of a person. Todd was great enough to send me some different things from Leela Quantum, like the Heal 360 capsules and the water bottle. And one thing I noticed was there was definitely something with the water bottle that I was like, all right, there's something different about the water here. And then I dove into a little bit of restructuring the water and whatnot. And that was enough for me. And I just went out, all right, what's the strongest block that they have? The super block? Cool, purchased. Right around my other shoulder there.
Go right on.
I was like, all right, just take my credit card, send me the super block, let me start messing with it. And I started doing some things with it where I would put, my food in there, my water in there. I started putting the bacteriostatic water for my peptides in there. And I noticed everything was starting to hit a little bit better. Things were starting to work a little bit better. I'm not really prone to placebo. I don't believe anything's going to work. I just dive in and see what happens. The biggest thing that made me go, all right, hold on a second, is I measure my HRV religiously, probably too much, to a point of being neurotic. It's my one health metric that's never good. It's usually between 20 and 30. Nothing I've been able to do has been able to ever fix it. My blood pressure is great. My resting heart rate's great. Everything's great. HRV, never been able to nail it. I've used all the devices, the parasympathetic tone shifting vagus nerve stimulators. They help by 2 or 3 points. That's it. Now I didn't take it for the first couple days, getting the super block in just because I hadn't been wearing my device to track it. Started wearing it again. My HRV is 40, 50, 60 every night, no matter what. It fluctuates a lot, but that is a 20, 30, 40 point jump. And the only difference is I've got the super block in my house. And nothing else has changed in my routine, my supplementation, anything. So I will now present to you this incredibly well-articulated question. What the fuck is going on?
So, okay, first let me say, so I've been the science guy for Leela for 6 years now. And when they very first started talking to me, they sent me a bunch of stuff because they wanted it tested and validated by a scientist. So they sent it to me. And at first, I was a little incredulous. And so then I tested the stuff, and one of the things was a water bottle, and lo and behold, it actually worked. So I reached back out to the fellow who founded it, Philip, and said, "What are you guys doing? Like, how are you doing this?" And he explained it to me, but it was coming from a very different perspective. It was like a network of spiritual guys and healers and energy workers, and that's how they did it. And so I was asking the question, like, do you have anybody who speaks science? Like, can you quantify this for me? No pun intended. And they didn't. And so literally I've worked with them like all the time for 6 years. And to be clear, I've never taken a penny for it. And the reason is as a scientist, sometimes when you get funding for things, it might skew your perspective, right? Because you don't want to like, if you work for a pharmaceutical company, you don't want to go, yeah, this is awful. Like this is killing people. I'm done. You need your payment. So it kind of biases things. So I have never taken a penny from him, but I was so impressed with how well it worked that I thought, okay, I'm going to be like the science translator for these guys and do all these experiments and help show how this is real because it is profound. So I have zero financial interest in it, but and I think it's just important that, but I mean, it's like a statement on the back of a paper, saying there's no conflict in interest and no financial ties to this. And there
Right.
aren't. So all I'm doing is just reporting how it works. So it's funny that we're having this talk because my dad, he had congestive heart failure and I did a bunch of stuff to fix him up. And one of the things that I gave him was a travel block to keep by his bedside. And he immediately noticed a shift. And last night we were having this talk and he was like, I don't get it. And he was a brilliant guy. He was a professor, like super smart. And he just did not understand, it was kind of like talking about a thermos, like, okay, so it's making this go up and it's making this go down. It's like, how does it know which is hot or cold? And that's, it gets back to the idea that there's this kind of underlying intelligence. But with the blocks and with the heal capsules and all that stuff, it's kind of a point of high quantum flux, right? So the field is persistent everywhere. You're never going to hit a spot where you're not in the quantum field, which is cool because that's what allows for non-locality, that you don't have to be close to somebody. Proximate distance is irrelevant. But when you have a point of high flux, it allows all of your vibrations to get bolstered up. So it just makes you a stronger you, right? So like True is stronger, ion is stronger. Whatever your particular vibration is, it's like the signal to the noise. So, from a biological sense, if you have something that kind of amps up your own function and it literally cranks up the volume on your own genetics, it makes you stronger. So, because you still have the same environmental assaults, right? We just did a thing where we were testing brain function using a 256 channel QEEG. And the people who were doing the testing at this institute in Europe thought, like, no way this is going to work. And so we did all these brain scans beforehand to get a baseline. And then we did it with an iPhone 15, a centimeter away from the head for 30 minutes. And man, I'll send you the images so you can post them. It completely racks out the brain. Like it
Wow.
shuts down all sorts of components. It's really legitimately pretty bad. And then we flipped on the thing called the quantum upgrade, which is basically like it streams a point of high flux to that person. And so you just need an individual identifier, a phone, a name, something, right? And this kind of leverages that idea that everyone is part of a field and the field is fundamentally intelligent. And literally within seconds of that kicking in, all of the brain normalized. And in some cases, it actually looked better than the before shots, and that was, I mean, it threw everybody on the research team a little bit because they just didn't expect that something like that could happen. And admittedly, like when I first started working with it, I didn't think that was possible. One of the first conferences I went to, our friend Todd Shipman came and Leela or Philip with Leela had invited me there and asked me to do a demonstration for people so they would know that it wasn't just total BS. And so I called Todd and said, hey man, we're going to be at this conference. I've got an idea on how to do a live demo so that people can see, that it's real. And Todd has a really horrible shellfish allergy. Like it'll trigger anaphylaxis. And so I said, you're allergic to crab, right? And he goes, yeah. Do you need me to like put some in my eye or something like crab juice? And I was like, absolutely not. No. But what I did was I took a can of crab meat on stage, and the video's online. You can find it. I opened the can of crab meat and dipped a derma roller, which is just like a little drum with a bunch of, perforations on it, little pins to pinprick the tissue. It's kind of mimicking a dermal stamp test that an allergist would do. So I dipped it in the crab juice and I rolled it up his arm, and instantly it broke out hives, the redness in one straight line on his arm. Then I put the can in a quantum block and just started lecturing about waveforms. And, because everybody thinks of a waveform as like that, but that's really not it. That's a kind of it's like the kindergarten 2D representation of something versus what it really is, which is, in my estimation, more like spheres that all have a chirality. They're rotating, they have a pressure gradient, and they're, as best I can figure with what I've done, about 21 different facets that you have to isolate to fully describe something in terms of how it's manifesting. And so after kind of prattling on about that, I took the can out, got a new derma roller, put it in the crab juice, and rolled his other arm, and nothing happened. And literally everybody, it was like a dog that had heard a new sound, because there was a lot of biohackers and a lot of doctors, and everybody kind of went, wrong, you know, because it was just such a weird effect. And then after the lecture was over, everybody got up. Literally like 100% of everybody got up and walked up to the front to look at his arms, because it was so wackadoodle that, I mean, one minute you have a histamine reaction, the next minute you don't. But it's because the interaction at a fundamental level, we're not solid. We're a collection of all these vibrating bits of information and strings of electricity that coalesce to form subatomics and then atomics and then molecules. And then it cascades up to become what we think of as ourselves. But it's really all of these vibrating bits. And so when you have a histamine reaction, what's really happening a couple levels below the biochemical portion is there's a discordant waveform interaction, right? You can have something that's concordant or something that's discordant. If it's discordant, it drops your body's power level. If it's concordant and you resonate with it, it increases your body's power level. It's the same reason that, I don't know if you've ever seen somebody do muscle testing, that it seems like a very fringe thing until you've actually had it done by somebody that does it, where they'll put a compound on your stomach or your solar plexus. And the first time I had a doctor do this with me, I was dumbfounded, like, what is this witchcraft? Because, you're holding your arm out and they push down on your arm to see how much strength you can exhibit. And I was legitimately trying to hold my arm locked, because all you're doing is engaging your delts, and that's it, right? And my arm just cratered, like it rocks down the moment I had something that was bad for me, as opposed to it's just rigid when it was a compound that was good for me. And it was the craziest thing. And that was probably a decade before I realized, like, oh, it's an expression of waveforms, right? The waveform is good for you, amplitude gets higher, that cascades up and your muscles get stronger. Waveform is bad for you, that cascades down and you get weaker. And so it's the same function.
So it's basically balancing things to put them as they should be. Is that the right way of putting it?
Yeah, it's balancing things to put them as they should be for you. And that's the thing that's actually very cool about it is specific to the person. So it's like the things when we'd run a spec analysis and then a redox analysis and see the compound going up if it was better or down if it was better. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is that makes you more you, it's like taking the resonant pattern that is you and your body and turning up the volume, right? Like, so let's say you're just sitting here and it's quiet and somebody turns on the stereo that's really loud. Well, it's going to throw you off because the noise is going to wash over you. But if somebody muffles that and puts it under a couple of blankets, it's not going to be that big a deal. Or if you're listening to some music and somebody turns on another song in the distance, that might muddle it up. But if you crank the volume on yours to 50 and theirs is still at a 2, you don't care. You're not even going to notice it. And that's kind of in effect what's happening is your own physiology is being expressed more strongly and coherently. You vibrate more effectively as you.
Now, how does this play into the concept of, I believe it's quantum matching? Because you mentioned before a utilization of BPC that's not really using BPC. So to my understanding, you can do something where if I put some water in a glass and a bottle of BPC in the quantum block, which is harnessing this quantum energy, I can then theoretically drink the water and reap some of the benefits of the BPC without the BPC itself being in my system. Am I correct?
100% correct. As weird as that is, yes, 100% correct. And you can even test for it and, see that is happening. Admittedly, it's very bizarre, but there was the Nobel laureate, Luc Montagnier. He got the Nobel Prize for isolating the HIV virus. The last, 10, 15 years of his professional career, he was doing all these things with water and information and trapping different frequencies in water. And I would, save the fact that he had won a Nobel Prize, everybody would have called him a quack. because his research got kind of panned a lot, but it was really legit. And if you read it, the stuff he was doing was mind-bendingly cool. Like one of the ones that really threw me, and there's a couple of documentaries about him that you can watch, was he took sample of a patient's blood that had HIV, and he put one drop of the blood in, I think, 100 cc's of water, then vortexed it, and then did a one drop sample of that and put it in another 100 cc's, vortexed it, and then kept going and did like a 7-fold dilution. So, which is effectively like measuring one drop out of all of the oceans in the world, right?
Mhm.
Like when you run a spec analysis on it, it's going to show water, nothing else. So then he used all this recording equipment, and he would record the frequencies that were emanating from that last vial of water. Then he would send the MP3 to a colleague at an institute, I think the Technical Institute of Italy, and it was like 1,500 kilometers away. He'd send the wave file over there. Then that guy would take a clear vial of water and play the waveform back in it. Then they added a thing called polymerase chain reactor. It's a powder, so you can kind of get an expression of the genetics. And when they would pull that, they had a 98% better than 98% match with the genetics of the person who had the blood. And
Wow.
it's yeah. And that's the thing, is it's all information, right? Vibration contains information. Literally, you and I are talking right now. Fundamentally, you're hearing me. That's one type of vibration. It's just that we're accustomed to it. You're seeing me. That's another type of vibration in a different portion of the same spectrum, right? As people, we pick up about 0.000001% of the total EMF spectra. There's a whole lot more going on than we're normally paying attention to, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
And so even though it's weird, it's real.
Now, what are some other ways that we can harness this for performance enhancement, longevity, anything really to just increase our just optimization as human beings? One modality that I've looked into that it turns out you've looked into as well are the Lakhovsky multi-wave oscillators, as an example. So that was something I was talking to Todd about, and then Todd goes, "Oh, Ian uses these," and sent me a picture of your elaborate setup for it. So how does that differentiate, just as another example of using frequency? Because from what I understand from my research I've been doing with them is these are sending out waves that are just increasing, I believe it's just the voltage or the frequency of the cells individually to bring them up to where they should be. How are those working, and how is that different or similar from all of this?
So it's different in that it's a different part of the spectrum. So those are working on cellular energetics. So normally a healthy cell is -70 to -90 millielectron volts, and that's kind of the potential that healthy cells function at. I deal a lot with people who have marginalized cell function because they have cancer, and so they're like -25 to -40, and that's the range where your cells become susceptible. A multi-wave oscillator pumps out all of these different high voltage electrical fields, and your cells, when they break things down, they you consume water, you consume food, all that stuff gets chemically broken down and then taken in. Well, you can also, anybody who's done any photobiomodulation or used a red light knows that you can get some pretty profound effects just by hitting your body with red light. And one of the mechanisms that that happens from is there's a component in your cells called cytochrome. And with certain frequencies of light, you excite the cytochrome. The cytochrome literally oscillates. And a lot of times it'll have a nitric oxide molecule on the top of it that would be normally kind of taking its time to move down the electron transport chain. But when you oscillate it with a specific frequency of light, it literally bumps it off, and then it cycles in an oxygen molecule. So you're photonically advancing the cell cycle. You're literally using light to stimulate your cell energetics. And so our cells can actually pull energy from sound waves. They can pull energy from light. They can pull energy from chemicals. And likewise, they can also pull energy across a whole different host of spectra from just ambient electricity in our field. And so, like with an MWO, I use a Lakhovsky chair in my lab. And so I'll set 2 coils that are tuned Tesla coils on the side of someone with a series of concentric rings and put them in the center of that. And the Tesla coil emits all these high frequency, high voltage static discharges. And then it breaks it down harmonically with the coils and the different rings so that your cells get exposed to a ton of different frequencies. The cells know exactly what they need. So they actually sort for what is missing. and then the rest of it just passes through. So there's literally a sending side and a receiving side, and you pump the frequencies through you, and your body is the impedance point, and it only picks up what's necessary, and then the rest just goes right through you. So it's another method of feeding. You're literally feeding your cells with electricity directly, as opposed to letting chemicals that you eat get broken down and then parsed out in terms of electrons and protons, which are doing the same exact thing. Ultimately, it's all about, protonation and electron flow. And you're just doing the same thing. You're just stimulating it with a different part of the frequency.
So a different pathway along the same lines of what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, utilizing carbon-60 to make the cells more efficient, clean them out, supercharge them. So now we're just doing it via these different modalities, be it quantum tech, be it the Lakhovsky multi-wave oscillators, be it even red light. So what are some other ways that we can optimize cellular function?
So PEMF is great, pulsed electromagnetic fields. I had a really bad motorcycle wreck a couple of years ago, and my femur hit the top of my tibia. So the femoral condyle, the curve at the bottom of your femur, punched into the top of my tibia 1 inch and created a 1 inch crater, and then split my tibia 6 inches down like a log. And it was literally wedged inside of the other bone. And so I set up the lab. The orthopedic surgeon, when I went in, they just done the scans on me and said, it's really bad. We're going to have to cut you from your quad down to your calf and put in pins and plates and screws and bone filler. And you'll be in traction for like 12 weeks. And then we'll start PT after that. But you can't put any weight on your leg for 12 weeks. And he said, when you're done, you're going to have so much metal in your leg that you'll be able to see it from the outside. And I said, is that the best you've got? And he said, yeah, man, that's standard of care. That's what we do. And I said, cool, I'm going to check myself out, which I think threw him a little bit. I think he actually probably thought I was in shock. But I did that. I called my staff and said, guys, I need you to go buy one of those fancy hospital beds, the raising, lowering things, buy it, set it up in front of the door at the office, and then come get me. And so like a day later, my staff came over to the hospital and kind of literally kind of wheeled me down on a gurney, perhaps without the knowledge of everyone there, and literally like a wounded dolphin schlepped me off and put me in the back of a Toyota Tundra on a bed sheet, and then drove me to my lab and set me up on that thing. And I set up PEMF coils, and I would use PEMF coils because when you're regenerating bone, you need something that's actually providing a really heavy signal to trigger osteoblastic formation, which is just what pumps out, the components that make your bone. And so I was trying to trigger osteoblasts. So I was oscillating very heavily with a high strength magnetic field, the bone, and it, in 9 weeks, I was completely healed. I was up and walking with no trace of a break, no metal in my system. I provided the energy and let the body do what it needs to do.
So similar to the multi-wave oscillators, but more specified in a direction that you can tune it to.
Exactly. It's a different wave. And it has, if you crank an MWO really, really extreme, like you crunch it all the way out, you're probably going to blow the circuits unless you have a really good one. But you can end up, with a little too much, and it'll stimulate you too much. With a PEMF unit, you can do the same thing, right? At first, it oscillates your bones. But if you really crank it, it'll actually move them to the point of pain. Because the whole thing, and if you put your arm in, it will automatically fire your muscles. You'll start twitching. For anybody who doesn't believe in, like the impact of electromagnetic fields on physiology, just sit down in a PEMF chair that's a real high strength PEMF unit, and it will auto fire your muscles. And when the moment you start twitching and going, what is happening? Yeah, there's a device called a PEMF that's like that. It's a super high strength emissive field. And man, that thing hits you 100% know it. It goes from the land of, pixie dust to, oh, this has an impact. It's because it literally moves your muscles, and all of your muscles fire without your input. And it's a very bizarre feeling, but it really does. It'll tell you like that, oh yeah, this is a legit thing. It's real.
Now, what's some low-hanging fruit that the people watching at home can start diving into to optimize cellular function, utilizing frequency, or maybe utilizing something supplemental? So obviously the carbon-60 easily accessible, and we'll plug the
Super.
website in the show notes and whatnot. But other pieces of maybe technology, supplementally, nutritionally, what else can we do to make sure that our cells are as strong as they can be, not only to prevent the diseases and the problems that you're out there trying to fix, but to optimize for performance, body composition? What are some other things that we can look into?
Well, so one of the things that's real low hanging fruit is just do a cyclic ketogenic diet from time to time, because that really upregulates the amount of electron flow. Like you can actually, if you go into a really deep state of ketosis, you actually have to be kind of careful sometimes if you're taking, some of my supplements, because you can kind of overclock the mitochondria and you actually blow them up, right? They start pumping so much energy across the membrane that they pop like popcorn and it lyses them. So there was a company called, well, I guess there still is a company called Bulletproof. And back in the day, the fellow who founded that reached out to me, and he had developed this thing called Upgraded Advantage, which was kind of a mitochondrial booster. And it was like PQQ and CoQ10. And we were at a dinner one time and I said, that thing you did that's kind of like a whole body stimulus for mitochondria. I said, I think I could upregulate that a bunch. So he said, yeah, go for it. See what you can do. So I took that product, tested it, looked at the ATP output, and then I developed a thing that was literally 3,300% of that capacity, which is not actually healthy, right? So
Right.
I wanted to know what are the boundaries of this? So sometimes when you're trying to figure out like, how do I make something that's really beneficial for people, you need to figure out what's the cliff, right? Like where is the precipice that somebody's going to biologically drop over? And in that case, it was what is going to blow up the mitochondria. So if you do that kind of stuff and you couple it with a cyclic ketogenic diet, you can optimize your cell function just off the charts. So you actually want to that's why I like cyclic ketogenic diets, because a long-term keto diet actually kind of whacks out the mucosal lining of your gut and opens you up to gut permeability, and the xylem junctions expand and all that junk. And it's not truly beneficial long-term, but as a short-term modality to kind of burn off fat, get shredded, amp up your energetics, and really metabolically tune yourself par excellence. It's just that's, the sweet spot. So that's easy because you don't have to do anything other than basically put the bag of chips down. You
Mhm.
know, just, I mean, it's not always an additive thing. A lot of times it's not what you tell people to take or to do. It's just them taking command of it and not doing something, exhibiting their willpower and saying, okay, I'm not going to eat a bunch of carbs right now. And then, if you couple that with just like a PEMF mat or something like that. So, or this stuff, right? Like the inhale water, it's good because what it does to your blood is it opens up your blood so that it's flowing more.
Mhm.
And, because everybody's blood, they form these things called rouleau formations, and it's kind of like a long string of red blood cells that are clustered. And it unfortunately it happens when you're around EMF stress or when your diet's crummy. And almost everybody's diet is to some extent kind of crummy because that's all the food we have access to for the most part. And then we're all, I mean, right now you and I are bathed in a sea of EMFs. And when that happens, all of your microvasculature, everything that supports a lot of the musculature in your body, all of those things are dialed in for 8 micron wide red blood cells. But when you form a string of those suckers, it doesn't matter how much oxygen is on them or anything. If they're all clustered together and they're 45 microns long, you cannot get that semi to move into that parking space where a car should go. It's a different scale, right? So even though you have the raw components and your pulse ox may look good or something like that, you're not delivering it the way that it needs to be delivered. So things like PEMF mats delocalize your blood like that, so the red blood cells spread out and they can actually move where they're supposed to go. The inhale water, that same thing, it spreads it out. Quantum blocks do it too. If you wear a heel capsule, that's a good one. And then just drinking a litany of water that is structured, that doesn't have a bunch of chemicals in it. That's probably the other thing that's the biggest, because people don't really realize it, but the water that your body consumes is not the water that you drink. You drink the water and then your mitochondria actually process the water. And at the very end of the electron transport chain, the output is ATP and water. And everybody says, this is something that I think is a little bit controversial, that I firmly believe, is everybody says ATP, that's the energy in the cell and water is a byproduct. I actually think that's wrong. I think, nature is pretty sharp. If it wanted ATP at the end of the equation because that was the goal, it would have had that at the end of the equation without any waste. The fact that water is at the end of the equation tells me that what you're actually trying to do is end up with this type of water. And I would posit that ATP is more like a battery on a phone, and the energy that comes into it, it's a phosphorylated battery, but the actual energy that comes in is coming from quantum fluctuations in water. And that's why it's really important to dial in the water, right? So if you looked at this and said, hey, this is power. No, it's not. It's a battery, right? You have to put the power in it. And I think the same thing applies, right? ATP is a great phosphorylated battery, but it's not actually the power. In my estimation, the power comes in from quantum fluctuations in water. And if you look at it, the way a body's actually built by molecular count, you're more than 99% water molecules. That's probably for a reason. I think a lot of times just the hubris of looking at things and go, oh, it's water. I understand water. Maybe, maybe not. There might actually be a lot more going on behind the scenes, kind of like Montagnier's experiments where he was locking in and encoding all this information in water. If you ask somebody like, oh, can you use water as a storage medium? They'll probably just say no. But then you read Montagnier's research and you go, okay, well, I guess you can. And it's that kind of supposition of oftentimes the biggest impediment to knowledge and moving things forward isn't lack of information. It's thinking that you already have the information, right? Like thinking that you already fundamentally understand something kind of boxes you out from probing more and pushing forward and continuing to look to see, really, is my understanding of this actually correct? Or am I just basing this on assessments that people have made before me when they did not have the tech to test things thoroughly? So it's kind of like this process where I think you have to constantly refresh. But water is a biggie, right? If you can just get your water dialed in, I can't think of any people that I know that are really high performing athletes where they don't actually focus on water, right? It's a huge component.
Tell me a little bit more about the inhale water, because you've managed to super infuse oxygen into water in a stable, sustainable way.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe you blew up a lab in putting this together. I did hear that actually, listening to another podcast. But we're in an era right now where, again, a lot of the tech and a lot of the sensationalized stuff is getting a lot of traction because it's eye catching or it's ear catching, and for good reason. I mean, people are talking about hyperbaric oxygen chambers. I recently ordered a micro bubble tub for basically it's like a hot tub that infuses the water with these micro super oxygenated waters. So amazing. That's a whole other topic. We'll have to dive into that in another time, but I'm getting mine in about 4 weeks. Yeah. But you've developed just a ready to drink, a water that has way more oxygen in it. So what's that doing?
So it's doing the same thing. There's kind of this magic threshold biologically where if you have 80 parts per million oxygen in a liquid, it changes the way things function. And it does that, what I was talking about with the rouleau formations, where it separates out your red blood cells. And I'll send you a picture. So we just finished our first clinical trial and showed, so I can actually say it because we've done a full IRB clinical and proved that it decreases your heart rate, increases your pulse ox. Because a lot of people literally will say, no, you can't consume oxygen in water. Yeah, actually you can. If you do it the right way, there's a diffusion that happens and it just moves into your bloodstream, and suddenly you upregulate the amount of oxygen systemically. And a lot of people use it that are, well, actually Todd's wife takes it because she's asthmatic. And I know a bunch of other people who do that, and people who are doing climbs where they're going up into high altitudes. Mm-hmm. They use it to nix oxygen or altitude sickness because of deprivation of oxygen. So there's all these benefits to it, but basically water normally has 5 to 8 parts per million oxygen. And so there's a couple of companies that I think their stuff is really good, Ophora and Cocoon, that have about 40 parts per million respectively. So like 40 and 41-ish. And then when I can this stuff, I super saturate it. So I squeeze it in under pressure at about 180 parts per million. And then when you open a can, it's right at about 100. And then just gas diffusion happens and it stabilizes around like 55, 57 after about an hour. But it's still, multiples of what you'd normally get. The best way to actually drink this stuff is so that you can get above that 80 parts per million threshold is crack the can and down it instantly. And when you do that, you feel it, right? Because you get a very quick rush of energy through your body. And we're doing another clinical trial with Andrews Medical, who does all the sports medicine for the NFL and a bunch of other groups. And we're doing another one with them to just kind of show the athletic benefit of it. When you were talking about hyperbaric oxygen, I think hyperbaric is fantastic, right? And in terms of, if you're talking to a cancer patient or something, that's something that I would love to be able to recommend as like a frontline therapy, because when cancer is an anaerobic function, so if you increase the static load of oxygen, you're going to have an effect on the proliferative rates of the cancer. You're going to decrease it. So if you can get somebody to do it, that's great. But I can't really recommend it because it's hard to get people to get into a hyperbaric chamber enough times to actually make it viable to do that. So the cancer protocol that I developed, I always put people on 3 cans of this stuff a day so that I can increase their SpO2 and hence decrease the proliferative rates. And so it's just one of those things that it's much easier. It was easier for me to figure out how to do this than to try and figure out how to get everybody into a hyperbaric chamber all the time. I mean, because hyperbaric therapy is badass. It's great.
Would there be any benefit to, alongside utilizing the inhale water for either somebody in, God forbid, a cancer situation or just general human optimization, to pairing this with something like a carbogen breathing device that breathes, basically infuses more carbon dioxide to raise the amount of oxygen in your blood? Or is that something that would be counterintuitive?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it actually because you'd probably overload yourself. Like I'll do like oxidrine or nitric oxide supplementation to kind of vasodilate myself or increase the amount of load I can carry.
Mm-hmm.
And you feel it. I mean, you feel super hop skippy. But I would, like with a carbogen, I'd actually be a little bit like, I would definitively say, don't do that. Don't do any shallow water diving, and don't put yourself in a hyperbaric chamber after you've had it, because you're gonna end up with so much oxygen. If you go into a hyperbaric chamber, you can actually trigger oxygen toxicity because you can squeeze too much of it into your tissues.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you increase the load internally and then you put yourself in a high pressure situation, you can hit too much and it can actually be problematic. So with that kind of stuff, the body's a balanced system, right? I try not to push it too far out of the extreme. Because I work with a lot of cancer patients pretty frequently and advise a lot of people. One of the things I see is a lot of times people are like, I'm going to throw everything at it. And they end up literally overtaxing their physiology because they're doing so much. It's akin to going to the gym and saying, I'm going to do chest 7 days a week, no breaks, 3 hours a day. It's like, yeah, that's not how bodies work. You have to keep it balanced. So I would actually just kind of pump the brakes on that and, do it in a more natural way. Like if I were doing a carbogen, I wouldn't do, inhale that day. Or if I were doing a hyperbaric, would not do inhale that day.
So just structure it intelligently. Maybe like
Yeah.
carbogen or hyperbaric oxygen chamber on an off day, and then post-workout do the inhale water. So at least stagger the systems out. So that would make perfect sense. No, I love that. And I think it all comes down to this necessity for a deeper understanding of this information that's out there. And it's one of those things where I try to tell people in my world, which is a little bit more of like the fitness and performance world, that we have so many different modalities that are at our fingertips, but you can't just listen to somebody say, this is good, do this. You have to do your best to understand what's going on beneath the surface, under the hood, so you can apply these things intelligently. So if anybody wanted to dive more into your work, Ian, where are they going to find more stuff that you're working on? Where's the easiest way for me to find more information like this?
Honestly, I don't really publicize it all that much. Like Inhale, most people don't even know that I'm related to it. Same thing with Leela, unless they hear me on a podcast or something like that. Wizard Sciences is pretty good because that's sort of my baby. And, every now and then I think the guys will push, kind of information out about what I'm working on. But there's a lot of things that I'm working on, luckily, that I get to work on that, just don't really see the light of day because it's projects for other groups or other parties. And, a lot of that, anytime I find something where I can try and move the needle in a big fashion just by leveraging some sort of new tech or figuring something out for somebody, I usually do it. And so there are a lot of those. I'm working on energy systems and propulsion systems and all kinds of bizarro stuff, anti-cancer things. And, there's just a ton of stuff that I get to work on, but it's not really, I'm actually not that public about it because I don't really see the benefit in it, other than people knowing where it's at. Like Inhale's great because it can help a bunch of people. So, they market that, but they don't need to, see my smiling face on it. I honestly could really care less. The products stand on their own. They don't need, like endorsed by, you know, you know, you know,
So let's do this. So in the show notes, I will absolutely link to where everybody can deep dive more into Wizard Science's Inhale and Leela Quantum. But
Sure.
let me change the traditional question a little bit for you, Ian. If I'm looking to optimize myself as a human being and
Okay.
I want to dive more into different modalities that you would recommend looking into to do so, where do I look?
So one of the things that I developed pretty recently, and it's based on a bunch of old Russian tech, and then a fellow named John Wong did a bunch of development on it, and then a fellow named Todd did a bunch, and then I did a bunch, and it's activating stem cells, to repair things, and doing it in an autologous fashion where it's coming from your own body. So the thing that I work with a lot is V cells. It's VSELS, very small embryonic like stem cells. And so you've got, like the normal thing, mesenchymal stem cells, then you've got Muse cells, and then you've got V cells. And so MSCs, mesenchymal stem cells, that's what a lot of people do. They'll go out and they'll get like umbilical stem cells and they'll use that. And I'm not, honestly, not, it works and it's really good and beneficial. But I think when you really start to kind of pull back the curtain and look behind it, there's some things that I think in the next couple of years, people start to really drill down on and maybe figure out a little more in totality, that namely, if you're using media from somebody else, even though it's kind of like putting a bumper on a car, right? You're like, hey, my bumper's broken. Well, I've got a bumper, and they take it from like a 1960s pickup and put the bumper on your car. Well, yeah, you just replaced your bumper. Badass. But it's not the bumper that's OEM for your vehicle, right? So there's going to be some little tweaks and weird things. And over time, my supposition would be that if you do that too many times and you introduce too much allogenic, just meaning, from an exterior source genetically, too much allogenic media, you're going to have something akin to a rejection, right? Like, if you replaced your kidney and you didn't go on any rejection drugs, you'd have a problem, right? And I would posit that the same thing happens if you do too many MSC procedures. Ultimately, you're going to start to have rejection issues and things, and people probably won't understand where it's coming from, because I've actually seen that happen a lot, and people are kind of like, "Oh, we don't understand why," and I'm like, "Well, you're pumping in a ton of genetic media that isn't you, so it's literally tuned in a different way." If you can do something with mesenchymal stem cells, you can't necessarily get them to differentiate into any tissue or organ system you want, right? So they're technically a thing called multipotent, and also just in terms of size, an MSC is maybe 15 to 20 microns in size. Muse cells are actually a little better. You can use those, and they're typically from your own body, so they're autologous, and they're a little smaller, so they're about 10 to 12 microns, but they're fully adult cells. So like mesenchymal stem cells are the age of the person that they were pulled from. So you pull them from an umbilical cord, then you're getting, day zero stem cells. You pull them from a 53-year-old person, you're getting 53-year-old stem cells, and they have the same degree of degradation. Muse cells, the same thing applies, right? They're smaller, so they can go more places, and they're also pluripotent, so they can become any type of germline. So you can do ectoderm, mesoderm, whatever, or not germline, but dermal line. So you can make all of the different tissue types. The V cells, the thing I dig about those is they're autologous. They come from your own body, and they're dormant. They're just, turns out, quiescent in our body. So they're quieted. They're in a dormant cycle, but they don't have any degradation in terms of their age. They're always day zero. But you have to turn them on, right? So I turn them on using cryoshock and lasers. And it turns out any hormetic stressor, you can actually activate them. So, it can be percussive shock that's a hormetic stressor. It can be sound waves. It can be light. It can be temperature. So you do this kind of hormetic stressor and you turn them on. And the thing that's great about those is they're day zero and they're 5 to 7 microns. So if you want to work on somebody's brain, you can literally pull them past the blood-brain barrier and there's no impediment to that. And you can do a lot of neural therapy work. So I've eliminated, and this is not I'm not misquoting here, type 1 diabetes a bunch of times now because you basically, you take someone's cells and you activate all of these dormant stem cells, and then I quantize them with a laser. So I set them up for a specific frequency, and that's, in my case, I used 4 different channels of laser light so that I could get differing depths of penetration inside the tissue systems. So if you're going through bone, you have to adjust it differently than if you're going through muscle. So I kind of figured out what the differing depths of deposition needed to be for different tissue and organ systems. And I'll, based on what I'm trying to work on. So if it's, somebody that's got type 1 diabetes and I'm working on the beta cells in the pancreas, I adjust it so that I can do deposition there. So I lock them into a specific frequency, then I reinfuse them, and then I move them into the target site in the pancreas and islets of Langerhans and trigger new beta cell production. And that turns out actually works, and it's not some sort of like death sentence where you have to be on insulin forever. You can actually reverse that. And I'm not the only person that's doing that. There's a couple of other research groups that have done similar things. There's one in China and one in Canada that have both done very, very similar things. So it's a possibility, but that's for some sort of specific pathology like diabetes. But I've used it on people with congestive heart failure. I've used it on people with Alzheimer's and a whole host of things. And then there's guys like our friend Blaine, who's just like a massive beast of a performance athlete, and worked on that with him. And it changes his overall function, because if you perfuse the body with all of these day 0 stem cell factors, they go in, and all of us have damage, right? So if you want to go in and you retool that, the body marks all of those things typically with a type of chemokine called a cytokine. So you have these markers systemically, and your body will target that and take all those cell factors and put all the stem cells in the right place so it repairs whatever is damaged. And I think that's one of my favorite things right now. And I'm doing that. My company is called MD Biophysics. And so we've been traveling all over and training doctors and surgeons and, all kinds of people to use that, because I certainly can't, treat everybody and help everybody. But, if you train a lot of people in like the best new systems, then it's, kind of a high leverage activity, because then suddenly you can help a lot more people. So that's a good one. I'm a big fan of that. I think it's probably the best additive technology in terms of like if somebody has missing something or needs something put in. It's not reductive though. So if you have, some toxicity for like spike proteins or glyphosate or heavy metals, you're going to want to do something like, therapeutic plasma exchange or apheresis or innisphoresis from Switzerland, like something like that, that really kind of takes the stuff that's not good out, like EBU, when you do the blood ozonation. Mm-hmm. That's a great procedure, that makes a big difference. So yeah, those are for super performance enhancement. That's, I think, par excellence. I think that's the best thing in the world right now.
That is the cutting edge of the cutting edge, as are most of these modalities. This is, Ian, you're so far ahead of the curve, man. I really hope that everybody that's been watching this has been taking notes and writing down things to do more deep dives into and look into, because this is stuff that not only could really optimize just human function, but this could help a lot of people. So, my hat goes off to you for everything that you're working on. And the fact that you're doing it so selflessly is a testament to you as a person as well. Yeah. This has been amazing. And I can't wait to deep dive into different topics with you. I know we discussed prior to going on air about doing some more projects that can bring this information to even more people. And I look forward to that. And in the meantime, all I can say is thank you so much for your time. And you you can't even put a price tag on the value of information that you brought to everybody. So again, I'll say it 1,000 times over. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've been taking notes. And if not, watch it again and take some notes. This has been the DDT Method podcast. And this is literally one of those episodes where I just have to stop and say, wow, I got a pretty cool job. Ian, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk to you next time.
Seriously, thank you for having me. So awesome. Peace out.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you guys next time on the DDT Method podcast.